Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into a topic the medieval world was exceptionally good at: paranoia. So, before you settle in, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from all corners of the globe. Now, go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that nice, soft background noise, and let's ease into tonight's adventure together. If you happen to be a medieval king, the safest thing you could possibly eat was, in reality, nothing at all. Because the royal kitchen wasn't just a kitchen. It was more like a medieval danger zone where every single pot, pan, and smiling servant represented a different potential murder attempt. The cooks weren't simply preparing meals. They were unintentionally, and sometimes intentionally, engaging in daily biochemical warfare. Picture this. You walk into your kitchen as the most powerful guy in the kingdom, and immediately you're met by the comforting aromas of boiling meat, burnt bread, and that one fish that really should have been buried months ago. The head cook assures you it's fresh, which, in medieval terms, means we scraped the flies off. And that's even before the conspiracies begin. To protect themselves, kings hired tasters. A prestigious-sounding title that seems noble until you realize it actually translates to, "Please eat this mystery stew, and let me know if it kills you." It's the only job where surviving lunch is considered a promotion. These tasters would bravely sample every single dish. If they lived through it, the king ate. If they didn't survive, the king ordered takeout. And by takeout, I mean more soup, but from the other cook who looks less likely to murder you. But here's the shocking truth. Medieval rulers weren't being overly dramatic. Poisoning was practically a national pastime. Few things terrified medieval Europeans more than water. Not demons, not the plague, not taxes, but water. Because water was unpredictable. It could nourish your crops, drown your children, or give you dysentery before breakfast. So when people started dying mysteriously, villagers did what medieval villagers always did: blamed the nearest well. The poisoned wells conspiracy spread like wildfire. If a family got sick, it was the well. If livestock died, it was the well. If the bread was burnt or your cousin tripped over a chicken, the well was clearly cursed. The Middle Ages had a very flexible relationship with cause and effect. But beneath all the panic and shouting, there was a sinister truth. Sometimes wells really were poisoned, not by witches, demons, or suspiciously shaped clouds, but by rival towns, invading armies, and the occasional extremely angry neighbor. During medieval sieges, poisoning wells was basically standard procedure. Armies would dump dead animals, toxic plants, or anything particularly disgusting into the enemy's water supply. Nothing says, "Please surrender," like finding a decomposing goat floating around in your bucket. Siege manuals even recommended it. Imagine a military guide that calmly advises, "Step 3, sabotage their plumbing." European villagers, however, didn't know about siege tactics. So when people started dying miles away from any battlefield, villagers invented their own explanations. Outsiders were the favorite suspects. A traveler just passing through? Definitely a poisoner. A merchant selling herbs? Absolutely a poisoner. Someone who looked like they could read? Don't even get them started. One of the darkest examples occurred during the Black Death when towns accused Jewish communities of poisoning wells. It wasn't true, but the tragedy highlights how deeply the conspiracy had rooted itself in medieval minds. Water was dangerous, mysterious, and perfect for accusations. Known more for their elegance than extravagance, these establishments weren't about rushing into pleasure. They were carefully designed sanctuaries. Here, desires were gently guided by ritual, engaging conversations, and a refined sense of charm. Even the entrances hinted at a sense of refined restraint. Think carved wooden doors, silken banners dancing in the breeze, and lanterns casting a warm, inviting glow that promised companionship bathed in grace. Inside, the air carried a delicate blend of incense, finely powdered sandalwood, and the light, sweet aroma of plum blossoms artfully arranged in porcelain vases. The rooms were adorned with folding screens, their muted colors depicting scenes of cranes in flight or serene mountain landscapes, softened by candlelight. Low tables held calligraphy brushes, wine cups, and musical instruments awaiting a performance. Everything was meticulously arranged to slow a visitor's breathing, calm any racing thoughts, and prepare them for the night's unique, unhurried rhythm. Unlike the courtesans of the flower pavilions, who were celebrated above all for their artistry, the women of these refined houses specialized in creating emotional connections and providing comfort. They greeted guests with soft, soothing voices and practiced gentleness, guiding conversations with an intuitive understanding of the mood and the underlying feelings in the air. A guest's worries were never dismissed or trivialized. Instead, they were absorbed into the warm, comforting atmosphere, becoming a part of the evening's quiet unfolding. Wine was served in moderation, never intended to dull the senses, but rather to ease any tension and create space for genuine connection. Honeyed plum wine, chrysanthemum-infused rice wine, or delicate pear liquor were poured into small, translucent cups. The army traveled light, extraordinarily light for its size. Soldiers carried only essential gear: weapons, armor, a cloak, a few days' worth of grain, and often just a simple cooking pot. Tents were mostly reserved for officers. Ordinary soldiers slept under the open sky, further reducing baggage weight and increasing speed. The less they carried, the faster they could move. And for Alexander, speed was as deadly as a spear. But movement was only half the story. The real miracle lay in consistently and reliably supplying the army. Alexander understood that fuel, food, water, and fodder were as important as bronze and iron. His scouts rode days ahead, meticulously mapping wells, rivers, and villages. Local cooperation was negotiated and secured before the army ever arrived. If an area couldn't support the troops, routes were changed. If grain was needed, caravans were organized. If the land was barren, rations were carefully adjusted, and marches were shortened to avoid exhaustion. This careful choreography made Alexander's army something almost unnatural for its time. A force that could move swiftly, strike suddenly, and survive in environments where other armies would quickly starve. The logistics were largely invisible to most, but they were the heartbeat, the silent engine, the reason a young king could lead an army across deserts, mountains, and empires without it collapsing under its own weight. Feeding 40,000 men wasn't just a challenge. It was a crisis waiting to happen every single day. Alexander's commanders understood this better than anyone. A soldier could fight without sleep. He could march with bleeding feet. But without food and water, the army was doomed to collapse. Discipline vanished, and the entire momentum of the campaign died. So, before any battle, any victory, any moment of glory, there was grain, tons of it hauled, bought, taxed, or foraged to keep the logistical machine alive. Water safety was as crucial as surgical skill. Contaminated wells could decimate entire companies. Scouts tested water sources before the soldiers drank. If water was questionable, it was boiled, filtered through cloth, or mixed with wine to kill bacteria, a surprisingly effective ancient method. In deserts, dehydration became a major threat. Alexander famously poured out a helmet of offered water in front of his troops, demonstrating that he wouldn't drink what they couldn't share. Moments like this fueled morale more than any speech. Morale itself was a vital logistical resource. Alexander knew that men who believed in their cause marched farther, fought harder, and endured suffering with fewer complaints. He cultivated loyalty deliberately, sharing meals with common soldiers, fighting at the front, honoring the dead by name, and generously distributing spoils. After victories, he organized games, feasts, and religious ceremonies to remind the army that their suffering had purpose. Rotations were another key tool. Alexander allowed units to rest, repair gear, and recover while others took the lead. In winter, he often paused major operations entirely, sheltering the army in cities or fertile lands where food and warmth were plentiful. These breaks prevented burnout, something many ancient commanders overlooked. Exhaustion was a constant threat. Heat stroke, frostbite, dysentery, and infections claimed more soldiers than swords. But Alexander minimized losses by caring for his men as the true assets of his campaign. Logistics wasn't only about moving supplies, but about maintaining the human core of the army, a force that followed him not out of fear, but out of belief. Alexander's vast, mobile empire couldn't function without communication. 40,000 men, spread across miles of marching columns, supply trains, scouting parties, and engineering units, needed a constant stream of orders that were clear, fast, and reliable. If the streets of the Subura were chaotic, the buildings towering above them were worse. The insulae, Rome's infamous tenement blocks, loomed over the district like crooked giants, stacked floor upon floor, rising 5, 6, sometimes 7 stories high. They leaned at odd angles, creaked in the wind, and swayed under the weight of hundreds of residents. These weren't homes built with care. They were investments built with speed. Landlords wanted rent, not longevity, and the result was some of the most dangerous living conditions. In the ancient world, stepping into an insula meant instantly feeling the oppressive weight of life squeezed into far too little space. The ground floor typically buzzed with activity, housing workshops and taverns that filled the air with a constant barrage of smoke, steam, and relentless noise. Above these, narrow staircases spiraled upwards, steep, uneven, and shrouded in darkness, even during the brightest daylight hours. Most residents found it necessary to carry a small oil lamp, just to avoid missteps, as a single slip on those treacherous stairs could easily result in a broken leg, or something far worse. The rooms themselves were incredibly tiny, often consisting of no more than a single, cramped chamber that served as living space for entire families. Furniture was kept to a bare minimum, usually just a straw mattress, a simple wooden stool, a few clay bowls, and perhaps, if someone was particularly fortunate, a curtain to provide a modicum of privacy. Kitchens were a rarity. Instead, residents cooked their meals using small braziers, which quickly filled the rooms with smoke and made fire a constant and ever-present threat. A single spark was all it took to send flames climbing throughout the entire building in a matter of minutes, turning an insula into a deadly and devastating inferno. Water was another constant struggle. Only the wealthier insulae boasted access to aqueduct-fed fountains within their courtyards. Why even bother trying to overthrow a throne through war, marching armies, spending tons of money, sweating and all that, when you could simply sprinkle something a little suspicious into the royal porridge? Take King John of England, for instance. Chroniclers insist he poisoned at least one rival, which honestly makes sense. The guy was petty enough to lose the crown jewels in a swamp, so poisoning a relative was probably just another Wednesday for him. The Byzantine Empire, on the other hand, turned assassination by food into a competitive sport. Courtiers exchanged poisons the way modern kids trade Pokemon cards. Some emperors didn't even bother ruling. They just waited for dinner, dramatically clutched their stomachs, and let the next cousin in line take over. Even the papal kitchens weren't safe. More than one cardinal conveniently dropped dead right before an election. Chroniclers blamed it on the will of God, which is the medieval way of saying please don't ask questions about what exactly is floating around in the wine. So yes, kings were paranoid, but honestly, they probably weren't paranoid enough. Every royal meal was basically a conspiracy theory waiting for confirmation. Every bowl was a threat. Every spoonful a cliffhanger. In medieval Europe, survival wasn't necessarily about courage or strength or some kind of divine blessing. It was about having a food taster who truly loved you. Medieval Europe had 2 major fears: anything that moved around in the woods after dark, and anything that moved around in the woods after dark while singing, which leads us directly to the era's juiciest conspiracy theory. Secret pagan cults hiding out in the forests, engaging in forbidden rituals under the moonlight, probably barefoot and definitely unwashed. Villagers swore these groups existed. The church swore these groups existed. Even the local cats probably swore these groups existed. And yet, even in peaceful times, wells could become toxic. Rain washed waste into them. Dead rats fell in. Moldy leaves fermented into a medieval smoothie of death. Most wells were essentially unfiltered holes in the ground surrounded by people who bathed once per year and believed germs were part of astrology. So, were wells poisoned? Technically, yes, but mostly by bacteria, something that medieval people would have considered witchcraft. Anyway, the irony here is painful. Medieval villagers terrified each other with stories of secret poisoners while nature did most of the poisoning for free. But when the entire world feels unstable, you tend to pick simple answers. And in the Middle Ages, the simplest answer to anything was, the well did it. Medieval Europe absolutely adored a good identity crisis. If someone wandered into town claiming to be a long-lost prince, people didn't question it. They immediately threw a feast, argued about lineage, and started sharpening pitchforks just in case. And this wasn't just because medieval people were gullible, though they were, but that's beside the point. It was because royal imposters actually happened quite frequently. In a world without photography, fingerprints, dental records, or even consistent spelling of names, identifying someone was basically a group guess. Does he look royal? Was the medieval version of a background check, and looking royal usually meant having all of your teeth and not smelling like onions. Enter one of the strangest cases, Richard of Eastwell. According to local stories, he appeared in Kent in the 1400s, claiming softly, politely, and mysteriously to be the secret son of Richard III. A pretty bold claim, right? But then he demonstrated skills that no ordinary peasant would have. Reading Latin, writing beautifully, holding utensils properly, and not flinching when people mention taxes, which is suspicious behavior indeed. The servers moved with a quiet grace, refilling a guest's cup just as it reached its final sip, as if reading their thoughts rather than waiting for a gesture. What often surprised newcomers was the emphasis placed on genuine connection rather than mere physical attraction. A night spent in one of these establishments might involve reciting poetry, listening to gentle songs played on the pipa, or sharing stories under the soft, flickering light of lanterns. Intimacy, when it occurred, unfolded gradually, much like the creation of a calligraphy masterpiece rather than a burst of passion. Each stroke was deliberate, balanced, and mindful. For weary officials, lonely scholars, and travelers far from their homes, these refined brothels offered something truly essential. A place where one felt truly seen, not as a title, a rank, or a burdened mind, but as a person with individual thoughts and feelings. The women, skilled in both empathy and subtle understanding, created an atmosphere where vulnerability was met with understanding and grace. By the time a guest stepped back out into the glowing streets, the world seemed a little lighter. Desire hadn't consumed them. It had soothed them, shaped into gentle companionship by the floating world's quietest artists. Behind the laughter, music, and gentle bustle of Kang's floating world lay spaces that very few visitors ever glimpsed. The hidden gardens and moonlit retreats reserved for those who were truly trusted, discreet, or exceptionally fortunate. These secluded courtyards were woven into the pleasure quarters like secret threads, quiet sanctuaries where the night deepened and the world softened into something intimate and dreamlike. Reaching one of these hidden havens often required passing through a narrow passageway, its walls lined with bamboo that whispered in the faintest breeze. The backbone of the army's diet was barley and wheat, with each soldier consuming roughly a kilogram a day. Multiply that by tens of thousands. Then add the needs of the cavalry horses, pack animals, and the herds that followed the army, and the numbers quickly spiraled into something staggering. Alexander solved this problem not with massive stockpiles, which would have slowed movement, but with constant acquisition. His scouts and quartermasters rode ahead, securing agreements with towns and villages before the army arrived. They negotiated for grain, fodder, salt, dried meat, and sometimes livestock, all to be delivered directly to the army's route. When cooperation failed, the Macedonians foraged aggressively. This wasn't random plundering. It was an organized sweep. Units spread out across a radius around the marching column, gathering grain, cutting fodder, and seizing essential supplies. But Alexander always preferred diplomacy over destruction. Burn a village today, and there's no food tomorrow. Secure its loyalty, and the entire supply line strengthens. The cavalry required even more careful attention, because a warhorse ate as much as 10 men, and Alexander had thousands of them. The availability of grasslands often determined military routes as much as strategic considerations. In barren regions, herds of sheep and cattle marched with the army, creating a living, mobile supply line. Fresh meat, milk, hides all moved on 4 legs, eating the land beneath them and feeding the army as needed. Water was the ultimate dictator of movement. On the march, the army often left at dawn, stopping at rivers or wells by noon, before the heat became lethal. Scouts identified water sources days in advance, marking safe routes across regions where a single mistake could mean dehydration and death for thousands of soldiers and animals. Alexander treated supply not as an afterthought, but as an invisible battlefield. In an era lacking radios, written dispatches carried by vehicles, and long-distance signaling devices beyond flags and fire beacons, this challenge was immense. Yet, Alexander managed it with a system so effective that his army moved like a single organism. The core of the communication network consisted of messengers, mounted couriers trained to navigate rough terrain at speed. These riders carried verbal or written orders from Alexander to his commanders, from commanders to officers, and from officers to the men. Their horses were the fastest in the army, and fresh mounts awaited them at intervals along major routes whenever Alexander anticipated intense activity. A courier could travel dozens of kilometers in a day, allowing Alexander to redirect entire units in hours rather than days. Within the marching column, coordination depended on discipline and structure. The army moved in organized blocks. Heavy infantry, cavalry, light troops, siege engineers, and baggage trains, each knowing its place and responsibilities. Officers used horn blasts, drums, and shouted commands to control the pace and spacing. A single change in formation required hundreds of men to shift simultaneously. Yet, because of rigorous training, maneuvers happened smoothly, even on narrow roads or uneven terrain. Before every major movement or battle, Alexander held councils with his generals. These meetings weren't ceremonial. They were tactical briefings. Alexander outlined objectives, explained the terrain, and assigned roles. His commanders could ask questions, raise concerns, and suggest alternatives. By the time the council ended, every senior officer understood the plan in detail, which was crucial for an army that often marched or fought far from its leader's direct line of sight. Communication extended beyond the army itself. Alexander cultivated a network of informants, diplomats, and friendly local rulers who relayed intelligence on enemy movements. The vast majority of residents had to carry buckets of water up and down several flights of stairs every single day, carefully navigating the crowded stairwells while trying desperately not to spill their precious supply. Nighttime brought its own unique set of challenges, primarily the ever-present darkness. Lamps were expensive, and oil was even more so. Consequently, many families were forced to sit in near total darkness after sunset, carefully conserving what little oil they had managed to acquire. Noise permeated the walls as if they were practically non-existent. Arguments, the cries of babies, drunken songs emanating from the taverns downstairs, and the constant footsteps of people coming and going created a never-ending cacophony. Residents of the insulae never knew true silence. Privacy was a luxury that very few could even imagine. And yet, despite all of these hardships, these vertical slums were vibrant hubs of community. Neighbors shared food, kept a watchful eye on each other's children, exchanged gossip, and worked together to protect one another from thieves. They lived stacked on top of each other, layer upon layer, like the strata of Rome's struggling classes. Freedmen, immigrants, manual laborers, widows, runaway slaves, and the wandering poor, all packed together in a space that was dangerous, overcrowded, and perpetually unstable. The insulae represented the harsh reality that lay hidden behind Rome's gleaming marble facade. In Subura, life didn't just take place in the streets. It extended upwards into the rickety towers, where survival meant adapting to a world that was built vertically rather than horizontally. If Subura had a pulse, that pulse beat strongest in its bustling street markets. From sunrise until well past dusk, the district transformed into a living, breathing marketplace, chaotic, loud, and utterly irresistible. And unfortunately for the Middle Ages, this conspiracy was actually true. But before you picture robed sorcerers summoning demons, imagine something far more historically accurate. A handful of completely exhausted peasants sneaking into the forest to chant old songs, burn herbs, and desperately hope that the crops will stop failing. Medieval life was incredibly stressful. You spent half the year starving and the other half trying not to die from the weather. If lighting a candle in the woods and whispering to the old spirits brought you some comfort, people were going to do it. And they absolutely did. These groups weren't sinister at all. They were more like illegal support groups with slightly better incense. But the church saw things very differently. Anything that wasn't stamped and approved by Rome was automatically considered a satanic plot, and that's where the forest cult hunters came in. Priests who marched into the woods armed with torches, holy water, and absolutely zero survival skills. Usually, they tripped over a root, screamed at an owl, and then went home claiming they had scared off a demon. But every now and then, they stumbled onto something real. Stone circles that locals were still using. Burned bundles of herbs arranged in weird patterns. Carved symbols that were older than Christianity. And half a dozen peasants who really did not want to discuss their hobbies. The most famous of these secret groups were the Benandanti in northern Italy. People who literally claimed they left their bodies at night to fight witches and protect their crops. And the crazy part is they believed it. The church interrogated them expecting demonic confessions and instead got a medieval version of Avengers roleplay. Then there were the forest magical healers, women and a few men who used herbs, salves, moonlight rituals, and maybe some light chanting to treat illnesses. Herbalism wasn't actually illegal unless you were good at it. He never admitted it outright, but he hinted heavily, and since medieval England adored drama, people completely believed him. Centuries later, historians still debate his origins because the details match just a little too well. Medieval record-keeping. It might as well have been scribbled on napkins, leaving the door open to all sorts of possibilities. But Richard wasn't alone in this. Medieval Europe was practically overrun with resurrected royals. A classic case is Anastasia of Poland, who died young, or so they said. Then a bunch of women popped up claiming to be her, knowing all the right stuff about the court and acting eerily familiar. Wars broke out over whether someone was really a princess or not, because nothing screams stable government like a bunch of guys on a battlefield yelling, "That's totally her," when they haven't a clue what she looked like. And then there were the times when the imposters weren't imposters at all. When things got dicey, some rulers would bolt, go into hiding, or try to dodge assassination by throwing on a disguise. A king or prince dressing like a regular Joe wasn't some crazy theory. It was a survival tactic, which meant every mysterious stranger story had a kernel of truth hiding underneath. The real kicker was that medieval politics lived for a good plot twist. If a royal croaked under fishy circumstances, which was basically always, people automatically figured the body was a fake, the death was a setup, or the ruler was chilling incognito somewhere, probably regretting his life choices. So yeah, royal imposters were a medieval conspiracy. And it happened so often that Europe eventually stopped asking, "Is this even possible?" and started asking, "Okay, which cousin is faking his death this time?" A carved gate, simple, elegant, and always partially shrouded in shadow, opened into a courtyard bathed in the soft, pale light of the moon. Here, the noise of the city faded away, as if caught by unseen hands. The air cooled, and the scents of night-blooming jasmine and damp stone replaced the incense and wine. These gardens were thoughtfully designed, not to impress with grandeur, but to soothe with harmony. Small koi ponds mirrored the moon, their surfaces occasionally disturbed by a ripple as fish glided silently beneath the lotus leaves. Rock formations were arranged with the same meticulous precision found in classical paintings, each stone chosen not for its size, but for its ability to balance the space. Pebbled paths curved gently, avoiding straight lines, as if encouraging visitors to wander and explore rather than simply arrive at a destination. Pavilions stood at the edges, their latticed windows glowing faintly with candlelight. Inside, low couches were set with embroidered cushions. Scrolls lay open on lacquered tables, and teapots released steady curls of steam. These retreats weren't built for ostentatious displays or loud revelry. They were built for quiet conversation, unhurried reflection, and the kind of companionship that didn't require any pretense or performance. Courtesans often brought their closest patrons here, not for mere intimacy in the traditional sense, but for something far rarer and more valuable: sincerity. Away from the prying eyes and social expectations of the district, masks often slipped away. Officials spoke of their doubts. Scholars confessed fears that the rigid examination system never allowed them to express. And wanderers told stories that the long, lonely roads had forced them to keep to themselves. The women, skilled at reading the subtle undercurrents of emotion, listened with patient awareness. Sometimes a pipa was played so softly that the notes seemed to float on the air rather than echo. Winning this battle meant his men stayed strong, healthy, and ready to fight. Losing it meant collapse, chaos, and defeat. Every day the army marched. The supply officers fought their own war. One measured not in casualties, but in grain sacks, hoof prints, and the precious sound of water flowing where it was desperately needed. Most of Alexander's victories are often remembered for their heroic clashes, phalanxes versus vast empires, cavalry charges versus disorganized chaos. But the real battleground lay beneath the soldiers' feet. Terrain was both enemy and ally. Roads, mountains, rivers, deserts, and mountain passes shaped the pace, direction, and ultimate survival of the entire campaign. Far more than any general's intentions or ambitions, Alexander understood this instinctively. He treated the land the way a master sailor treats the wind, something to respect, exploit, and never, ever underestimate. The Macedonian army moved along routes chosen with obsessive precision. Scouts and engineers rode ahead, carefully studying the ground, measuring distances, locating water sources, and evaluating whether a column miles long could even pass through a particular area. A road that was too narrow or muddy could snarl the entire army and expose it to a devastating ambush. A river that was too swift could drown hundreds of men and animals. Time and again, Alexander avoided potential disaster simply by altering a route by a few miles. A small adjustment with massive consequences. Crossing mountains was among the hardest and most dangerous tasks. The Balkan ranges, the Taurus mountains, and especially the towering Hindu Kush tested the army beyond human endurance. Narrow passes forced men to march single file. The intense cold turned weapons brittle. Snow blinded horses and men. Avalanches and rockfalls threatened entire units. Envoys carried messages between conquered cities, ensuring smooth transitions and reliable regional governance. Even during rapid advances, Alexander left behind functioning administrative structures capable of maintaining supplies, order, and loyalty. Coordination wasn't merely military, it was deeply logistical. When the army needed to pivot suddenly, communication ensured that scouts moved first, supply trains rerouted, engineers adjusted their tasks, and baggage animals shifted formation. Without this synchronization, the army would have fragmented into chaos. What made Alexander's logistical genius so astonishing wasn't just that he supplied his army, but that he kept every part of it moving together. Orders flowed like blood through arteries, never stopping, never slowing, ensuring that his war machine marched with unity, precision, and purpose. For nearly a decade, Alexander's logistical system held together under pressures that would have shattered any ordinary army. It fed men across scorching deserts, moved siege equipment over mountains, supplied war horses across barren plains, and coordinated thousands of moving parts with razor-sharp precision. But even the greatest logistical machinery has its limits, and in the final years of the campaign, Alexander began to confront them. The first cracks appeared in India. The monsoon rains turned roads into rivers. Grain rotted before it could be cooked. Baggage animals sank into mud so deep that entire carts disappeared. Scouts struggled to find reliable landmarks in a landscape transformed by storms. Even seasoned commanders admitted they had never encountered terrain so hostile to movement. Every kilometer forward felt like a negotiation with nature. Then came the emotional strain. The army had marched for years, far longer than any soldier had anticipated. Homesickness became a logistical threat in itself. Every alleyway, courtyard, and open patch of dirt became a trading floor, where coins changed hands as quickly as insults were exchanged. Sabura didn't have the polished, marble-columned markets of the Forum. It had mud, sweat, bargaining, and the constant struggle for survival. Vendors arrived before the break of dawn, dragging carts or carrying baskets suspended from yokes across their shoulders. They staked out their spots with practiced aggression, arguing over every inch of available space. By the time the first rays of sunlight touched the rooftops, the very smell of the district had already undergone a dramatic transformation. Roasted nuts, boiling lentils, salted fish, grilling sausages, and onions sizzling in oil filled the air with a tantalizing aroma. Hungry laborers crowded around the food stalls, eating quickly on their feet before heading off to work. The food was cheap, simple, and filling, providing the necessary sustenance for a hard day's labor. Bakers sold flatbreads still warm from the clay ovens. Fishmongers displayed their morning catch on wooden planks drenched with water, attracting both stray cats and desperate children alike. Greengrocers shouted out the prices for olives, leeks, chickpeas, and figs. Women sold porridge ladled into clay bowls for a single coin. A few, more fortunate vendors offered luxuries, such as honey cakes, dates from Syria, or spiced wine. However, these were rare treats reserved for special occasions. Beyond food, Sabura's streets were overflowing with traders selling virtually anything that a Roman might need. Leather workers laid out sandals and belts. Tinkers displayed bronze pans, pots, and repair tools. Barbers set up their stools right on the street, shaving customers while the latest gossip flowed freely around them. Fortune tellers read palms beside herbalists, selling remedies for headaches, fevers, or broken hearts. Then suddenly it was considered devil magic. So yes, the rumors were true. Medieval Europe really did have secret pagan cults hiding out in the trees. Not evil, not monstrous, just very committed to not letting the church completely ruin their vibe. If you grew up picturing medieval monks as peaceful men, quietly copying books and baking bread, I'm sorry to break it to you, but some of them were basically the CIA in robes. While villagers were praying, nobles were scheming, and kings were worrying about their soup, the monasteries were carrying out a very different kind of holy mission: information gathering. And yes, that's the medieval term for spying. The church, being the single largest institution in Europe, needed eyes everywhere. And who better to do that than monks? They were literate, quiet, and already trained to observe human sin with the intensity of a judgmental cat. They traveled between monasteries, collected gossip disguised as confessions, and wrote everything down in neatly organized manuscripts. One could call them historians, but the more accurate term is intelligence analysts with better handwriting. The Dominicans were the worst offenders or the best, depending on how much you enjoy organized paranoia. Their entire order was founded on rooting out heresy, which meant interviewing villagers, intercepting letters, and watching people a little too closely. If a medieval man even sneezed near the wrong scripture, a Dominican friar would magically appear asking follow-up questions. Monastic travelers made excellent spies. They moved freely through kingdoms, carrying letters that nobody dared to inspect because nobody wanted to risk going to hell for harassing a monk. Many kings secretly paid monks to report on court scandals, troop movements, and whether their nobles were planning any suspicious feasts. It was basically the medieval version of a subscription service. Things got even more interesting with the rise of the Inquisition. If you've ever wondered what the medieval version of a restricted section looked like, picture a small, dusty room inside a monastery, locked up tight and guarded by a monk who looks like he hasn't slept since the Third Crusade. Inside, shelves of books the church didn't want anyone reading, and that villagers whispered about like they were cursed. And here's the kicker: these forbidden book stashes actually existed. The church controlled most of the education back then. If you wanted to read, write, or do anything more mentally stimulating than counting sheep, you had to go through them. Naturally, they also got to decide what you weren't allowed to read. Anything that threatened their power, went against the Bible, or suggested the earth did something scandalous like, move, was quietly taken out of circulation. But they didn't just burn everything. Burning is messy, smoky, and attracts nosy peasants who ask questions nobody wants to answer. Instead, they locked up the forbidden stuff in special archives known as auraria, scriptor vaults, or sometimes just the locked room nobody ever went into except Brother Thomas, who always looked guilty when he came out. So what was inside? A surprisingly mixed bag. There were heretical gospels with opinions that could get you interrogated faster than you could say Inquisition. There were works of Arabic science that were obviously right but inconveniently ahead of Christian teachings. There were medical books discussing anatomy in a way that made bishops faint. There were even old pagan manuscripts that monks copied for research purposes, which was the medieval way of saying, "I was curious, but don't tell anyone." The best part is that church officials constantly argued about these vaults. Some thought the knowledge had to be saved for future generations. Others thought it should be locked away forever because it raised too many uncomfortable questions. Sometimes only silence filled the space, shared comfortably between two people as they watched the lantern light tremble on the pond's surface. And sometimes, when the moon was high and the jasmine scent was strongest, guests felt as though they had stepped entirely outside of the everyday world. These hidden gardens were the quiet heart of the floating world, places where pleasure transformed into peace, and where the night itself seemed to pause to listen. In Kang's floating world, music and calligraphy weren't simply pastimes or hobbies. They were languages, refined expressions that revealed the inner rhythm of the night. While visitors often arrived seeking conversation, comfort, or entertainment, many found themselves unexpectedly captivated by these quieter arts. They formed the backbone of the district's emotional landscape, transforming fleeting evenings into memories that lingered like ink on silk. Music came first, drifting through the pleasure quarters like a soft, gentle breeze. The pipa, with its pear-shaped body and bright, fluid notes, was the most familiar voice of the night. Courtesans plucked its strings with fingertips hardened by practice, yet softened by grace, producing melodies that could shift from playful to melancholic with a single change in tempo. Alongside it, the guzheng offered deeper, more meditative tones, slow, trembling vibrations that seemed to resonate directly in the chest. Guests who closed their eyes often swore they could hear mountains, rivers, and vast open skies within its unhurried rhythms. Bamboo flutes added another layer, carrying warm, breathy notes that floated above the district like birds crossing a dusk sky. Small ensembles sometimes gathered spontaneously in tea houses or pavilions, blending instruments the way calligraphers blended ink. The result wasn't a performance meant to dazzle and impress, but an atmosphere meant to envelop and embrace, each note placed with care, each silence allowed to breathe. Yet Alexander planned each ascent with mathematical calm and precision. Carefully timed breaks at sheltered ledges, fires prepared in advance, pack animals redistributed to prevent accidents, and precious reserves of grain saved specifically for these deadly climbs. The deserts were even worse. The Syrian steppe, the fringes of Mesopotamia, and later the Gedrosian desert presented a kind of warfare without an enemy, a constant battle against heat, thirst, and disorientation. Alexander's movement through these regions depended entirely on prior intelligence. Local guides, captured scouts, traders, and nomads were interrogated, bribed, or otherwise persuaded to share their knowledge of wells, hidden springs, and shaded wadis. A single incorrect direction could doom thousands. Alexander's genius lay not just in following advice, but in choosing the right advisors. Even open plains required a high degree of skill and planning. The army marched in flexible blocks, keeping cavalry close to protect the vulnerable supply trains. Engineers improved roads on the spot, leveling uneven ground, laying planks over marshy areas, and reinforcing the banks of river edges. Where bridges didn't exist, they built them. Where rivers were too wide to ford, Alexander used ferries, rafts, or captured ships. Every crossing was a major construction project executed at military speed. Movement wasn't just about transportation, it was about strategy. By mastering the land, Alexander mastered time. He arrived when his enemies thought he was still weeks away. He struck before they believed any movement was even possible. The terrain didn't slow him down. It amplified his strength, and that, more than any sword or spear, made his campaign seemingly unstoppable. No ancient campaign survived on brute strength alone. Armies without reliable information walked blindly into deserts, ambushes, empty storehouses, and poisoned wells. Alexander understood this better than any commander of his age. Rumors spread that the edge of the world lay ahead, that monsters lived in the eastern forests, and that there was no way to return. When Alexander demanded they press deeper into India, his men refused, not out of cowardice, but because logistics, both physical and psychological, had reached a breaking point. Food was unreliable, the weather was punishing, and morale was dangerously low. The retreat through the Gadrosian Desert was the final, devastating blow. Alexander attempted to march his army along a coastal route so remote and barren that even local tribes avoided it. Water was almost non-existent. Wells were scattered and often dry. Heat killed faster than enemy blades. Baggage animals collapsed. Supplies had to be rationed to mere handfuls. Men marched delirious, leaving behind comrades who could no longer stand. No tactical genius could outrun thirst. This wasn't a failure of planning. It was the brutal reality that some environments simply couldn't support tens of thousands of people. Logistics, the foundation of Alexander's conquests, had finally met a battlefield it couldn't win. Yet, even in these dire circumstances, the system held long enough to save the army from total annihilation. Scouts still searched for water. Remaining supply ships shadowed the coast, dropping off what little they could. Officers maintained order. Alexander shared his men's suffering, refusing any special treatment. That alone kept the army from completely dissolving. By the time the shattered force reached safety, the lesson was clear. Alexander had pushed logistics to its limits, and perhaps beyond. His campaigns weren't just a triumph of military strategy, but a testament to how far planning, discipline, and relentless willpower could carry a civilization across the unknown. And in the end, it was logistics, not swords, that drew the final boundary of his empire. The Subura didn't welcome you gently. It hit you hard in the nose, in the ears, in the chest. Performers, including jugglers, flute players, and snake handlers, drew crowds that often blocked entire walkways. The noise was incessant. Vendors shouted in a cacophony of languages, including Latin, Greek, Syriac, and Egyptian dialects. Buyers argued fiercely, trying to knock even a single coin off the price. Children darted between people's legs. Dogs barked. Chickens escaped from their cages. Somewhere amidst all the frenzy, a skilled thief was always making his move. Markets were easy hunting grounds for nimble fingers. But Subura's street markets were far more than just places of commerce. They were the district's social arena. Women exchanged news and gossip as they bought their vegetables. Men debated the results of gladiator fights over cups of spiced wine. Passing soldiers flirted with the stall keepers. Gossip flowed as freely as smoke from the cooking fires. If something significant happened in Rome, a scandal, a death, or a political upheaval, the Subura markets were among the first to know, and they spread the news faster than any herald could. In these crowded streets, survival was an art form. Selling, buying, and bargaining all required a keen instinct and a resilient spirit. The market wasn't just where Suburans fed their families. It was where they lived their lives, minute by minute, in a noisy, smoky, and unforgettable way. No district in Rome lived closer to the brink of disaster than Subura. It was a place where danger didn't require an invading army or a widespread rebellion. It could easily spark from a simple kitchen fire, a drunken argument, or a minor misunderstanding in a crowded alleyway. And when disaster struck in Subura, it struck with a vengeance. Subura was infamous throughout the empire for three things in particular: fires, riots, and a deep-seated mutual distrust between its residents and the officials who were supposedly meant to control them. Fires were the oldest and most persistent enemy. Suddenly, the church had an entire institution dedicated to gathering incriminating information. Monks interviewed heretics, interrogated locals, and wrote down the juiciest rumors to send up the chain of command. Some reports were very serious, detailing political uprisings, illegal pagan rites, and hidden rebellions. Others read like medieval gossip magazines. Brother Gregory reports that the shoemaker's wife was seen at night carrying suspicious herbs, possibly a witch. Further surveillance is definitely needed. Not all monks were involved in spying, of course, but enough were that people began to notice. Villagers whispered that the monasteries knew everything, and they weren't wrong. A monk could walk into a town, buy some bread, ask 3 polite questions, and suddenly know more about your marriage than your spouse did. So yes, the conspiracy was real, Behind all the chanting and the candles, medieval monasteries ran a quiet, continent-wide network of information, secrets, and surveillance. And unlike most medieval institutions, it actually worked. It turns out that the most dangerous weapon in the Middle Ages wasn't the sword or the crossbow, or even poison stew. It was a monk with a really good memory. If you were to ask a medieval European what the Knights Templar were really up to, they'd probably whisper something like, oh, guarding treasure, hoarding secrets, worshipping mysterious severed heads, controlling kings, threatening the Pope, inventing banking, summoning demons, just normal nighttime stuff. Medieval people absolutely loved a dramatic conspiracy, and the Templars were their favorite target. The best part is, some of it was actually true. The Templars started out as a small group of knights sworn to protect pilgrims, noble, holy, admirable. But then they experienced a terrible curse. They became successful. Within a century, they were so powerful that kings had to schedule their paranoia around them. Like, if this pagan text can correctly predict an eclipse, what else is it right about? Cue silence, awkward shuffling, and a bishop coughing loudly to change the subject. These vaults weren't just rumors. They were official policy. When inquisitors raided the libraries of accused heretics, they didn't just destroy everything. They cataloged it, studied it, and filed it away. Knowledge, even the forbidden kind, was power. The conspiracy was real because people sensed exactly what was going on. Somewhere in those monasteries were books that could change minds, challenge authority, or reveal truths medieval Europe just wasn't ready to handle. So were the villages, right? Absolutely. Behind the incense, the chanting, and the locked oak doors, the church kept a carefully curated collection of forbidden knowledge. And like all treasure in the Middle Ages, the best way to protect it was to pretend it didn't exist. If there was one place in medieval Europe where conspiracy wasn't just a theory, but a daily way of life, it was Italy. Venice, Florence, Milan, Genoa, Siena, beautiful places now, but back then, they were basically high-budget gangster movies with better architecture. These city-states spent centuries pretending to be peaceful trading hubs while secretly waging a silent, non-stop war of espionage, bribery, and back-alley diplomacy. And for years, Italians whispered about a shadow conflict beneath the official alliances and treaties. A hidden war of spies, saboteurs, coded letters, and accidents that always seemed to happen to politically inconvenient people. The conspiracy sounded dramatic, even theatrical. Unfortunately, every single part of it was true. See, the Italian city-states were crazy jealous. If Florence made bank, Siena had a meltdown. If Venice signed a trade deal, Genoa threw a fit. If Milan built a tower a little taller than their neighbors, a feud would start that lasted 3 generations. Calligraphy offered a different kind of quiet magic. Courtesans kept inkstones ready at all times, along with brushes made of wolf, rabbit, or goat hair, each selected for specific strokes. When a guest expressed interest, a woman might kneel beside a low table and slowly grind ink, allowing its fragrance to rise before guiding the brush across fresh paper. The act was meditative, its beauty lying not only in the finished characters, but in the fluid motion of the wrist and arm. Some wrote classical verses, others painted free-flowing characters meant to match the mood of the evening. Guests often found themselves mesmerized, not by the meaning of the words, but by the serenity of the process, the way each stroke seemed to gather emotion and release it with controlled precision. To witness music and calligraphy in Kang's floating world was to understand that artistry here wasn't merely ornamental. It was essential. It created moments that required nothing but presence. And in a world where so much of life rushed forward relentlessly, these arts invited guests to pause, to breathe, to listen, to watch ink bloom on paper, and to realize that beauty could be both delicate and enduring. The pleasure quarters of Kang were shaped as much by those who visited them as by those who performed within them. Each night drew in a diverse mix of personalities: scholars, merchants, government officials, travelers, and dreamers, all seeking something different, yet all softened by the district's gentle allure. Here, social status blurred, titles lost their rigidity, and people met one another not through their rank or position, but through their mood, curiosity, and shared appreciation for subtle beauty. Scholars were among the most frequent visitors. Many had spent the day immersed in the demanding rigors of preparing for the imperial examinations, a system that required perfect memory, flawless reasoning, and unwavering discipline. His empire was built not just by phalanxes, but by eyes and ears, scouts, informants, interpreters, diplomats, and local guides who formed the nervous system of his entire logistical machine. Every march began with careful reconnaissance. Days before the main column moved, Alexander's highly mobile light cavalry scouts rode out in wide arcs ahead, sometimes covering 50 kilometers a day. They mapped the terrain, checked water sources, counted livestock in villages, and watched for any signs of hostile forces. Their reports determined everything: the road to be taken, the pace of the march, the timing of attacks, and the need for supplies. A wrong report could kill thousands. A good one saved them. But scouts alone weren't enough. Alexander relied heavily on local cooperation. In Asia Minor, he negotiated with Greek cities who gladly opened their gates. In Syria and Mesopotamia, he made deals with caravan traders who knew every well and oasis. In Bactria and Sogdia, he turned captured tribal leaders into guides rather than enemies, offering them positions of power, wealth, or amnesty. Alexander understood something simple but rare for his time. A coerced guide tells you where you want to go. A willing guide tells you where you need to go. Linguistic intelligence was absolutely crucial. The army employed interpreters skilled in Persian, Aramaic, Egyptian, and dozens of other regional dialects. They questioned villagers about food stores, asked shepherds about mountain passes, and listened to merchants' rumors about enemy movements. Sometimes Alexander himself conducted the interrogations. His curiosity was legendary. A single shepherd, a caravan driver, even a child who knew where a hidden spring lay could determine whether the next day's march ended in success or disaster. Diplomacy served logistics as much as it served strategy. With a wave of noise, smoke, heat, and humanity so dense it felt like stepping into a different universe altogether. Only a few steps separated it from the respectable districts of Rome, yet the contrast was so stark, it might as well have been a different city. Behind you lay marble temples and orderly streets. Ahead sprawled a chaotic maze of taverns, brothels, workshops, and towering insulae tenements, leaning over the streets like crooked giants. The first thing anyone noticed was the sound. The Subura never slept. Even at dawn, the streets throbbed with shouted arguments, clattering carts, children chasing each other through alleys, and prostitutes calling out from balconies. Vendors hollered prices for bread, olives, lamp oil, and boiled sausages. Smiths hammered metal in doorways. Beggars sang or cried for coins. And above it all, laundry lines stretched between windows like makeshift banners swaying in the warm Roman breeze. Smells layered on top of each other. With smoke, fish stew, spilled wine, the sweat of hundreds of laborers, wet clay from potters' workshops, and the unmistakable stench rising from gutters that doubled as sewers. It wasn't pleasant, but it was alive. The Subura was the beating heart of Rome's working class, a district where life was loud, fast, and constantly on the edge of disorder. The buildings rose high, often 5 or 6 stories, constructed cheaply by landlords who cared more about rent than safety. Fires were common, collapses even more so. Families squeezed into tiny rooms lit by a single oil lamp. Freedmen, immigrants, craftsmen, gladiators, prostitutes, and criminals all lived wall to wall, layered above shops and taverns that never closed. You could buy anything in the Subura: food, sex, stolen goods, gossip, forged documents, protection, or trouble you hadn't intended to find. Then there were the streets themselves, narrow, twisting, and half hidden by shadows. They felt like they were watching you. The insulae, constructed from cheap timber and dry plaster, transformed into tinderboxes during the hot summer months. A single overturned oil lamp or a cooking brazier was all it took to ignite an entire building. Flames raced up the wooden stairways like ladders, spreading from apartment to apartment in a matter of minutes. Smoke filled the narrow streets long before the residents realized that they were trapped. Neighbors burst into each other's rooms, grabbing children and hauling elderly tenants down collapsing staircases. Fire was indiscriminate, devouring everything in its path. Subura lacked an organized firefighting force. Buckets of water, wet cloths, and desperate shouts were the only weapons available to combat the flames. Sometimes the urban cohorts arrived with axes to tear down burning walls, but more often than not, the fire had already consumed half the block. People rebuilt again and again because they had no other place to go. Riots were just as commonplace. Overcrowded living conditions, pervasive poverty, chronic hunger, rampant crime, and constant stress combined to make Subura a veritable boiling pot. If a landlord raised the rent, a fight would inevitably break out. If a corrupt official demanded bribes, crowds would gather, armed with stones. If two gangs argued over territory, the entire street would quickly turn into a battleground. Wine-fueled tavern brawls often spilled out into the alleys. During festival seasons, the excitement frequently turned chaotic. Torches, drums, and drunken shouts often pushed the crowds past the point of control. The city authorities feared Subura. Urban cohorts patrolled the district rarely, and always in large groups. Politicians ordered their guards to avoid certain streets altogether. Entering Subura unprotected was considered foolish, even for the most hardened soldiers. The residents didn't trust the authorities either. The Templars owned castles, land, fleets of ships, and more money than half of Europe. They were essentially a medieval combination of the Navy SEALs, the Federal Reserve, and that one cult your aunt keeps researching online. And with great power comes great suspicion, right? Rumors spread that the Templars guarded a massive treasure hoard. Unfortunately for Europe, this part is true. They were the first to create a Europe-wide banking system. Pilgrims could deposit money in England and withdraw it in Jerusalem, which feels suspiciously modern for people who were still afraid of mirrors. The Templars kept coded records, operated secure vaults, and moved money with a level of efficiency that terrified kings and deeply annoyed tax collectors. Then there were the secret rituals. Templars met in private, conducted ceremonies at night, and swore oaths that no outsider could witness. Naturally, this led Europe to assume they were worshipping a mysterious severed head named Baphomet, which is the medieval way of saying we have absolutely no idea what they're doing, so let's just assume the worst. In truth, their rituals were secret because they involved confessions, discipline, and organizational rules, boring stuff. But medieval minds simply couldn't accept boring. They needed drama, and drama they got. King Philip IV of France, perpetually broke and very talented at blaming other people, decided that the Templars were heretics, which is the medieval way of saying, I want your stuff. He had them arrested, tortured, and forced into confessions so absurd they make modern conspiracy theories look shy. Except here's the twist. Philip wasn't entirely wrong. The Templars really did hold a treasure, they really did run a secretive empire of money, and they really did keep knowledge hidden from the public. Not demonic knowledge, just banking procedures and military codes. But for medieval Europe, that was basically the same thing. They competed in everything. Commerce, banking, architecture, fashion, and even assassinations. Yeah, assassinations counted as cultural achievements. Out of this mess came one of the most sophisticated espionage systems in medieval Europe. Venice, especially, was legendary. The Venetian government created an entire secret intelligence council, complete with coded messages, financial surveillance, diplomatic intercepts, and a network of spies scattered across Europe like paranoid confetti. Their enemies feared them, their allies feared them, even Venetians feared them. Venice also had the infamous Bocce di Leone, public drop boxes where citizens could anonymously report conspiracies, crimes, or if their neighbor was acting suspiciously Italian. These messages were reviewed by a secret council that decided what needed to be investigated, discouraged, or quietly taken care of. Italy didn't invent the deep state. It just gave it better outfits. Meanwhile, Florence had its own spy network, staffed by the Medici family, who were so rich they could have bought the concept of honesty and still said, maybe later. Florence specialized in bribery and banking manipulation. Milan specialized in intimidation. Genoa specialized in naval sabotage. Siena specialized in pretending it was minding its own business when it absolutely wasn't. The result was a constant, silent war. No armies marching, no banners waving, just merchants disappearing, letters getting rewritten, alliances collapsing overnight, and treaties accidentally catching fire. So yeah, the conspiracy theorists were right. Italy wasn't just fighting wars. It was fighting all the wars, but quietly, politely, and always with impeccable style. Long before the Da Vinci Code convinced half the internet that Jesus had a secret family living the good life in France, medieval Europe was already obsessed with holy bloodlines, hidden heirs, and scandalous genealogies. By the time evening arrived, their minds ached with classical complexities and bureaucratic anxieties. In the floating world, they found release. Tea houses became their temporary sanctuaries, where debates flowed more freely, and courtesans skilled in literature offered insights that surprised even the most self-assured young intellectuals. Some scholars left with new verses to contemplate. Others left with hearts gently touched by a courtesan's calm smile. Merchants, weary from constant negotiation and travel, came seeking something different. Companionship that didn't hinge on profit or financial gain. They enjoyed the warmth of a shared drink, stories exchanged beside lantern light, and the comfort of being treated not as negotiators, but as fellow human beings. Many brought exotic goods from distant provinces, spices, fabrics, carved trinkets, and gifted them to their favorite courtesans, hoping not to buy affection, but to honor their artistry. Officials arrived cautiously, wrapped in layers of duty and official secrecy. Yet within the pleasure quarters, even strict-faced bureaucrats softened. Some sought intellectual sparring partners. Others sought silence and respite from the demands of their positions. A few came simply to observe, finding comfort in watching life unfold without needing to control it. The courtesans understood how to navigate these men, listening without judgment, offering empathy without obligation. Then there were the wanderers, individuals with stories shaped by the open road. Soldiers between assignments, monks passing through the capital, entertainers from other cities, and young dreamers unsure of their place in the world. They came without expectations, content simply to sit beneath the lanterns, sip warm tea, and feel a part of a wider, gentler human tapestry. What bound all these diverse groups together was a shared desire for refuge. Alexander frequently sent envoys ahead of the army to negotiate for supplies, request safe passage, or intimidate local rulers into cooperation. Cooperation meant food and water. Resistance meant scorched earth and starvation. So Alexander made cooperation profitable: protection for loyalty, autonomy for obedience, and honor for assistance. Local elites often preferred partnership to outright destruction. Information allowed the army to move with the precision of a finely crafted weapon. Without intelligence, the phalanxes might still fight bravely, but bravery alone doesn't locate rivers, refill grain storehouses, or reveal hidden roads. Alexander's scouts and informants didn't just support the campaign, they enabled it. They turned the unknown into the predictable, and the predictable into victory. Battles may have defined Alexander's legend, but sieges defined his endurance. Taking a walled city wasn't a matter of courage. It was a matter of logistics, engineering supplies, manpower, timber, tools, food reserves, and, above all, time. Every siege drained resources at a terrifying rate. And yet Alexander never hesitated to assault a fortified city, because he had mastered the unmistakable rhythm of siege warfare. Build, supply, pressure, and outlast. When the army laid siege to a city, the first order wasn't to attack. It was to build. Engineers and carpenters stepped forward with their tools, axes, and ropes. They required huge quantities of timber for ladders, battering rams, catapults, torsion engines, siege towers, and protective screens. This timber came from forests miles away, cut by labor detachments who marched with axes rather than spears. The trees were felled, shaped, loaded onto carts or pack animals, and hauled to the siege lines. The army became a massive construction workforce overnight. Alexander's engineers were among the finest in the ancient world. Stray dogs darted between legs, Thieves moved like ghosts. Drunks slept in doorways while debt collectors stalked the alleys like predatory cats. Every corner whispered a rumor or held a secret. To the elite, the Subura was Rome's shame. To the poor, it was home. To travelers, it was overwhelming. But to Rome itself, it was essential. A place where the empire's laborers lived, where its gossip was born, and where its pulse beat loudest. Entering the Subura meant entering Rome's raw truth. If the Subura had temples, they weren't built of marble. They were built of cheap wood, cracked clay, and smoke-blackened beams. These temples were the taverns, the true gathering places of the district. Drinking houses stood on every corner, squeezed between workshops and brothels, glowing with lamplight day and night. They were always full, always loud, always trouble waiting to happen. Inside, the air was thick enough to taste. Smoke from oil lamps mixed with steam rising from boiling pots of stew, and the sour odor of old wine soaked into the wooden walls. Patrons sat shoulder to shoulder on benches, shouting over one another, slamming clay cups, laughing, arguing, flirting, or plotting. A tavern in the Subura wasn't just a place to drink. It was a marketplace of stories, rumors, insults, and opportunities. Cheap wine flowed constantly, watered down but served in endless clay cups. Stronger stuff, imported from the provinces unofficially, was available if you knew who to pay. Bread dipped in garlic oil, bowls of lentils, sausages sizzling on iron pans, and fried fish from the Tiber were the standard fare. Food wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to keep laborers standing for another day of hard work. The tavern owners knew their clientele well. Posts were driven into the bar to chain up drunk troublemakers. Bodyguards lounged near the entrance, ready to throw out thieves pretending to be customers. They viewed them as outsiders, tax collectors, and enforcers of rules that failed to take their daily struggles into consideration. Subura handled its own justice. Thieves were beaten by their neighbors. Troublemakers were chased out of the district. Gangs negotiated truces without involving law enforcement. And yet, in moments of true disaster, unity appeared instantly. When a wall collapsed, dozens of people would rush to help dig out the survivors. When a riot turned truly deadly, neighbors shielded children and strangers alike. Subura was volatile, unpredictable, and dangerous, but it was also fiercely protective of its own. Here, survival wasn't just a hobby. It was a community instinct, forged in fire, fear, and resilience. For all its grime, danger, and endless noise, Subura possessed something that the polished districts of Rome lacked: a soul. It wasn't a district built on marble pride or aristocratic ceremony. It was built on human energy, raw, unfiltered, and relentless. Subura was where Rome's heartbeat could be felt at street level, where the empire's poorest and boldest residents carved out a life in the cracks of the city. Culture thrived here, not in libraries or lecture halls, but in the very fabric of daily life. Storytelling took place in taverns over cheap wine, where old men recounted tales of gladiator fights, love affairs gone wrong, and whispered rumors of imperial scandals overheard by drunken soldiers. Music drifted from the upper floors, played on flutes, drums, or improvised instruments beaten on clay pots. Children danced barefoot in the alleys, chasing each other through shadows illuminated by flickering oil lamps. Languages mixed constantly. Latin blended with Greek, Aramaic, Punic, Egyptian dialects, and the rough accents of Gaul and Thrace. In a single marketplace, you could hear 10 different regions of the empire represented in a single, heated argument. So yes, the Templars were victims of lies, but they were also absolutely guilty of being too powerful for their own good. Their secrecy wasn't dark magic. It was just good bookkeeping, which in medieval Europe was practically witchcraft. Anyway, when the Black Death rolled into Europe in 1347, people naturally started looking for answers. What caused it? How did it spread so fast? Why did it seem to prefer crowded cities and men who never washed their hands? Most villagers blamed demons, bad air, or their neighbor's weird-looking goat. But a particularly juicy conspiracy theory emerged. The church knew more about the plague than it publicly admitted. And disturbingly, This time, the conspiracy wasn't entirely wrong. The papacy and the higher clergy had access to medical reports, merchant letters, and incoming ship logs that ordinary people never saw. They knew when outbreaks were spreading through port cities. They knew when trade routes were collapsing. They knew that entire monasteries were dropping like flies. And while peasants were still out in the fields wondering why their neighbor had suddenly exploded in boils, bishops were quietly packing their bags and temporarily relocating to countryside villas with much better airflow. To be fair, medieval clergy weren't exactly doctors. Half of them thought illness came from corrupted humors, and the other half thought it came from God being mildly irritated. But they did have one undeniable advantage: information. And information in the Middle Ages moved slower than a peasant on a Monday morning. There are records of bishops closing city gates in advance of plague waves without explaining why. Monasteries locked themselves down from the inside. Clergy warned each other in coded letters with phrases like, "The ship brings dark tidings," which is the medieval equivalent of "do not go outside." "Everything is on fire." Even more suspicious were the quarantine orders. The conspiracy was simple. Noble families were secretly descended from sacred or royal ancestors, and they were hiding the proof. Villagers whispered about it, nobles denied it, and chroniclers recorded it with the enthusiasm of guys who loved gossip more than journalism. And the best part? Some of it was actually true. In medieval Europe, legitimacy was everything. You couldn't rule a village, let alone a kingdom, without waving your family tree around like a holy relic. But family trees back then were messy. Affairs happened, wars happened, and the occasional mysterious baby showed up during a pilgrimage. People pretended not to notice. It was all very polite and deeply suspicious. So, the nobles came up with a solution: hide the embarrassing branches and exaggerate the impressive ones. Suddenly, half the noble families in Europe were claiming descent from Charlemagne, a guy who, if these lineages were accurate, must have fathered about 4,000 kids. Others claimed Trojan ancestors, Roman emperors, or King David. Medieval genealogists weren't historians. They were creative writers with quills. But underneath all the nonsense, real hidden bloodlines did exist. Letters discovered centuries later revealed illegitimate royal children quietly placed in monasteries, foster homes, or distant countryside estates with the vague instruction, "Raise this kid and don't ask questions." Some resurfaced, some didn't. Some had descendants who found out 500 years later that great-great-grandma wasn't a peasant after all. She was the secret daughter of a duke with poor impulse control. One of the juiciest examples involves the Capetian dynasty of France, which secretly supported certain noble houses financially for generations, houses suspiciously connected to lost royal infants. Meanwhile, English chroniclers recorded hidden heirs living under fake names during civil wars, waiting for the right moment to reclaim the throne, which usually meant never, absolutely never. The pleasure quarters weren't an escape from responsibility, but a pause from its overwhelming weight. A place where emotion, beauty, and conversation flowed freely. Here, every visitor, regardless of their origin, found a small corner of belonging in Kang's luminous night. As night in Kang slowly faded into the pale edges of dawn, the pleasure quarters began their quiet transformation. Lanterns, once glowing like warm constellations, flickered as their oil ran low. The music softened, conversations tapered off, and the floating world, so vibrant only hours before, began to gently fold itself away, like silk robes being carefully stored after an evening of elegance. The streets at this hour carried a rare stillness. The laughter and footsteps that had echoed beneath the eaves were now muted, replaced by the soft sweep of brooms and the rustle of early morning vendors preparing their stalls. The scent of jasmine and warmed wine faded, replaced by the cooler fragrance of dew on stone and the faint sweetness of steamed buns rising in nearby kitchens. Tea houses closed their carved doors one by one, curtains falling like tired eyelids after a long night of stories, debates, and hushed secrets. Within the flower pavilions, courtesans extinguished their candles and loosened their elaborate hairstyles, letting the accumulated weight of the day slip free. Their instruments rested on low tables, strings cooling in the morning air. The women moved with a gentler, more private grace now, not the polished performance of the knight, but the quiet routine of those who lived between two worlds. Some sat by their windows, watching the sky brighten. Others wrote a final line of calligraphy to calm their minds before sleep. For them, dawn marked not the beginning, but the end. The hidden gardens fell completely silent. Moonlit ponds that had reflected whispered confessions now mirrored the earliest hints of sunlight. The koi moved lazily, undisturbed by the absence of voices. They analyzed walls, identified weak points, calculated angles for artillery, and directed the placement of siege towers. Carpenters built platforms and walkways. Miners dug tunnels beneath the walls, shoring them up with timber that could later be burned to collapse entire sections. Every structure required a steady flow of nails, ropes, pulleys, hides, shields, and spare wood. Siege logistics resembled running a massive workshop under constant hostile fire. Food became an even bigger challenge during sieges because the army stopped moving. When stationary, consumption rose while foraging decreased. To compensate, Alexander pre-planned supply lines before beginning a siege. Grain was stored in temporary depots behind the army. Convoys of pack animals rotated between the depots and the front lines. Whenever possible, he secured cooperation from nearby villages to keep food flowing. A siege could last days or months. Without prearranged supplies, even the strongest army would starve. Time truly was the most precious resource. A prolonged siege carried the risk of disease, desertion, supply shortages, and enemy reinforcements. Therefore, Alexander applied constant pressure. Artillery bombarded walls day and night. Sappers dug relentlessly. Marines conducted amphibious assaults when cities were situated near water. The goal wasn't merely to breach walls, but to shatter morale, ensuring the city surrendered before their supplies ran out. Every stone hurled from a catapult, every siege tower rolled forward, every underground tunnel supported by timber reflected the same truth. Alexander didn't win sieges through brute force. He won them through logistics, a calculated blend of engineering and relentless preparation that wore down enemy cities long before the final breach. Water, while essential for survival, also posed one of the most dangerous obstacles to Alexander's army. Prostitutes drifted from table to table, offering a smile, a conversation, or far more if the price was right. Gamblers tossed knucklebones in the corners, gathering small crowds as arguments flared over every dice roll. Above all, the tavern was Rome's gossip furnace. News traveled faster here than in the Senate. If a politician had embarrassed himself, the Subura knew. If a gladiator had refused to fight, the Subura whispered about it. If a wealthy merchant's daughter had run off, the Subura had the details within hours. Drunken speech loosened secrets, and the tavern keepers remembered everything. Fights broke out often, sometimes from insults, sometimes from pickpockets caught in the act, sometimes simply because someone had won too many cups. But violence was almost routine here. The crowd parted, the fists flew, and then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. Someone bought wine to restore peace, and life flowed on. In the Subura, taverns weren't distractions. They were the soundtrack of the district, noisy, smoky, crowded places where Rome's working class laughed, bled, schemed, and survived. When the sun dipped behind Rome's hills, the Subura didn't quiet down. It sharpened. The night brought a new kind of energy, thicker and more dangerous than the daytime chaos. Oil lamps flickered to life, throwing long shadows across the crooked streets. From behind painted doorways and beaded curtains came the soft murmurs and bright laughter of Rome's most infamous profession, the brothels of the Subura. Brothels came in every form. Some were little more than a single room behind a tavern, where a mattress on the floor and a curtain for privacy passed as comfort. Others were multi-room establishments run by experienced leany, madams, who knew how to handle clients, bribe guards, keep the peace between rival pimps, and squeeze money from customers who claimed they were broke. Subura wasn't diverse because Rome intentionally made it that way. It was diverse because Rome absorbed the world, and the world flowed downhill into its cheapest district. Religion was equally vibrant. Street shrines stood beside doorways. Tiny statues of the Laras, household gods, watched over families struggling to make ends meet. Women lit incense and cracked clay bowls in offering. Men left coins or bread scraps at makeshift altars. Foreign cults also had a foothold in the district, including Syrian, Egyptian, Jewish, and Mithraic faiths. Sabura accepted any god who accepted its people. Faith wasn't just a ritual here, it was a means of survival. Despite its somewhat dubious reputation, Sabura also produced a wealth of talent. Actors, boxers, gladiators, fortune-tellers, healers, midwives, craftsmen, cooks, and musicians all emerged from its tangled streets. Many of Rome's most colorful personalities hailed from this district. Some rose to fame while others rose to infamy. Most simply lived unnoticed but essential lives, supporting the vast machinery of the empire from below. Identity in Sabura wasn't defined by ancestry or wealth. It was about toughness, street smarts, a sense of community, knowing which areas to avoid after dark, knowing who to greet and who to shun, and knowing how to stretch a single coin until the next payday. Families who had survived for generations in Sabura developed a fierce sense of pride. Being a Saburanus became more than just an address. It became a defining characteristic. Rome's elite often dismissed Sabura as a pit of vice and depravity. However, if the district were to vanish, Rome itself would collapse. Its workers built the city's monuments, stocked its markets, carried its burdens, and whispered the rumors that kept its politics alive. Sabura was chaotic, dangerous, and exhausting, but it was also utterly irreplaceable. Some were issued before the plague had visibly reached the region, which means that someone somewhere knew something. Merchants noticed it too. Venetian traders wrote about strange warnings from church officials, telling them to avoid certain ports a week before the plague erupted there. That's not divine prophecy. That's insider trading with extra steps. Meanwhile, the official advice given to the public was far less helpful. People were told to repent, pray harder, burn aromatic herbs, or avoid excessive joy. Yes, really, joy was considered a plague risk. Medieval Europe was truly committed to suffering. So, did the church intentionally hide things? Probably not with malicious intent, but they absolutely prioritized themselves and withheld timely warnings because they didn't want to cause panic, lose authority, or admit that they had no idea how to stop it. In the end, the peasants weren't wrong. Someone did no more. They just weren't sharing. If you picture medieval monks as peaceful men humming hymns and tending herb gardens, it's time to gently set that image on fire. Because hidden among the holy texts and the chanting were certain specialists, discreet gentlemen, problem solvers, men who could recite the Psalms from memory and also eliminate a political rival without disturbing the choir practice. Yes, medieval Europe had cloistered assassins. And no, this is not the plot of some questionable Netflix show. It was real. These men weren't monks by spiritual calling. They were monks by convenience. Joining a monastery gave you shelter, food, legal protection, and the ability to travel between kingdoms without anyone asking why you had a suspiciously heavy bag. Monastic robes were basically the medieval version of an all-access VIP pass. And who hired these holy hitmen? Nobles, of course. The same people who were already trying to poison each other's soup. And then there's the church. Monks occasionally wrote irritated notes like, "Another noble child has been entrusted to us. Origin, blank," which was medieval code for, "Somebody dropped off a baby again, and nobody will tell us who the parents are." So, was there a conspiracy around holy bloodlines? Yes, but not because they were sacred. They were secret because they involved scandalous affairs, hidden heirs, swapped identities, and political insurance babies, all tucked away behind thick castle walls. Medieval Europe didn't need mythical descendants of Christ. It already had enough royal drama to last until the apocalypse. When medieval Christians whispered about secret Jewish and Muslim networks operating beneath the surface of Europe, they imagined something dramatic. Shadowy conspirators trading coded messages, plotting rebellions, and coordinating across kingdoms like a medieval Illuminati. Naturally, the church panicked, the kings panicked, the villagers panicked, and the goats panicked because goats always panic. But here's the twist, and almost no medieval person was prepared for it. The networks actually existed, just not for the sinister reasons people thought. They weren't planning world domination. They were planning survival. During the Middle Ages, Jewish and Muslim communities were constantly persecuted, overtaxed, expelled, or, on particularly stressful Tuesdays, accused of poisoning wells, summoning demons, or staring too suspiciously at bread. So, to avoid being wiped out, these communities created underground systems of communication and escape. Quiet, subtle, and definitely not meant to overthrow anything except their own bad luck. These networks included safe houses, coded routes, sympathetic merchants, and doctors who traveled in disguise. Entire families fled across borders using prearranged signals. A lamp in a window, a scratched doorway, or a phrase like, "Is the pomegranate harvest good this year?" The pavilions stood empty, their paper windows glowing softly, as if holding the last traces of the night's memories. Even here, the atmosphere shifted from enchantment to rest, from intimacy to stillness. Patrons departed slowly, stepping out with the lingering sense of peacefulness that the district so carefully cultivated. Scholars held their robes a little tighter, thinking over poems recited hours earlier. Officials walked with lighter expressions, their burdens temporarily eased. Merchants breathed in the cool morning air, savoring the rare feeling of a night spent not in negotiation, but in gentle company. By the time the sun rose fully, the floating world had nearly vanished. The pleasure quarters appeared ordinary again, just another part of the city. Yet those who had walked its lantern-lit paths carried something with them, the sensation of having lived, even briefly, in a realm shaped by art, beauty, and human connection. And they knew that when night returned, Kang's hidden world would awaken once more, ready to offer another evening of soft light, refined companionship, and dreams painted in music and silk. When people think of Alexander the Great, images of epic battles often come to mind: the dust clouds of Issus, the daring river charge at the Hydaspes, the phalanxes locked in gleaming formation. But none of those victories would have been possible without something quieter, far less glamorous, yet infinitely more important: the logistical machine that supported him. His army didn't simply march across continents because its soldiers were brave and determined. They marched because every step was carefully calculated, because supplies flowed efficiently, and because the entire system worked with clockwork precision. From the moment Alexander left Macedon in 334 BCE, he wasn't just leading an army. He was commanding a moving city of nearly 40,000 men. Rivers were unpredictable. Floods could decimate camps, currents could sweep away cavalry, and wide crossings could split the army, leaving half vulnerable to ambush. Yet, Alexander crossed more major rivers than any commander of his era: the Granicus, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Indus, and countless smaller streams. Each crossing wasn't just a simple march, but a logistical marvel of coordination, engineering, and precise timing. The first step was reconnaissance. Scouts assessed the depth, speed, bank stability, and potential fording points. Engineers then determined the safest crossing method. In shallow rivers, soldiers crossed in tight formations, shields interlocked to break the current. Horses swam alongside them, guided by reins held high. But deeper rivers demanded more ingenuity. Alexander used ferryboats and makeshift rafts whenever possible. Local vessels were seized or hired. Horses were ferried across on barges or made to swim, guided by handlers paddling alongside. The army lashed together reeds, logs, and inflated animal skins to create buoyant platforms capable of carrying siege equipment, carts, and grain. Artillery was dismantled into pieces, ferried across, and reassembled on the other bank. Alexander's preferred tactic was psychological: crossing at night or upstream, forcing enemies to guess the actual crossing point. At the Tigris River, the army crossed under cover of darkness, using their shields strapped to their backs as flotation devices. At the Hydaspes River, he repeatedly marched his troops up and down the riverbank to confuse King Porus, then used a hidden island upstream to launch a surprise crossing during a heavy rainstorm. Maritime logistics expanded dramatically once Alexander controlled the Phoenician ports. Shipwrights from Sidon and Tyre built and repaired vessels for him. Fleets transported grain, siege equipment, and reinforcements along the Mediterranean coast, making coastal marches much safer. The wealthiest brothels offered mosaics on the walls, perfumes in clay jars, and women or men dressed in fine linen. But even these luxury houses remained firmly Suburan, loud, smoky, passionate, and always slightly dangerous. The sex workers of the Subura were a diverse mix. Some were slaves working off debts or fulfilling the orders of their owners. Others were freed women or freedmen who had chosen the trade because it offered more coins than weaving, hauling, or street selling. A few were runaways, fugitives, or people whose families had abandoned them to survive as they could. They came from Greece, Syria, Egypt, Gaul, and every corner of the empire. The Subura was a melting pot of languages, accents, desires, and desperation. Their windows had little painted signs. Sandals for women, fallaces for men, masks for variety shows, and lamp symbols indicating rooms available. Patrons lined up in the corridors, coins in hand, bargaining loudly. Inside, the mood was unpredictable, sometimes playful, sometimes melancholy, sometimes brutal. The madams enforced rules to keep fights from erupting, but in a district like the Subura, trouble never stayed quiet for long. And yet, brothels weren't only places of lust. They were centers of information. Soldiers bragged about upcoming deployments. Merchants whispered about shady deals. Politicians' henchmen sought discretion and sometimes offered bribes or secrets. A single evening could expose a rumor worth a fortune. Prostitutes listened and remembered. Their knowledge made them valuable, protected, and occasionally feared. Walking past the brothels meant passing throbbing music, muffled arguments, sudden laughter, and shadows that moved faster than the lamplight. The Subura's night economy wasn't hidden. It was the district's lifeblood, pulsing openly through the streets. Here, vice wasn't shameful. It was business, it was survival, it was the Subura. If a noble wanted something done quietly, efficiently, and with plausible deniability, he didn't send a knight. Knights were loud. Knights bragged. Knights tripped over their own armor. No, he sent brother so-and-so who shouldn't be asked any questions. These monks were often lay brothers, members of the monastery who performed manual labor and didn't spend their days copying manuscripts. They had strong arms, few witnesses, and an excellent excuse for traveling. I am collecting alms. Nothing suspicious there except for the dagger tucked under the robe. The chronicles never say these men existed openly, but they leave clues. Too many clues. A noble dies mysteriously. A political rival conveniently falls from a window. A stubborn landowner suddenly repents, donates everything to the church, and vanishes. Monks appear in letters complaining about brothers who fail to observe spiritual discipline, which is monastic code for someone keeps sneaking out at night, and we have no idea where he's going. There are even recorded cases of monks being caught with weapons, disguises, or heretical correspondence. None of them confessed, of course. Monks had excellent poker faces and the added advantage of implying that any accusation was an attack on God himself, and kingdoms tolerated it. Why? Because monasteries solved problems efficiently, discreetly, and with minimal cleanup required. So yes, medieval villagers whispered that some monks were far more dangerous than their sermons suggested. And for once, the villagers were absolutely right. Behind the candles and the psalms, some monasteries housed men who could pray for your soul and send you to meet God personally. When people think about witch hunts, they usually imagine the 1500s and 1600s. Bonfires, pointy hats, angry men yelling about Satan hiding in their goat. But the truth is that secret witch hunts were happening long before they became fashionable, which was medieval code for, "Hello, I am in danger and would like to leave immediately." Jewish communities maintained informal transit routes stretching from France to the Rhineland to Iberia, with each stop overseen by someone who had mastered the ancient art of pretending nothing suspicious was happening. Meanwhile, Muslim communities in Spain and North Africa maintained cross-Mediterranean escape paths, moving fugitives, scholars, and persecuted families with remarkable efficiency. Compared to most medieval institutions, which functioned like a donkey slogging through molasses, these networks were shockingly competent. Of course, Christians interpreted this competence as proof of conspiracy. If a persecuted group managed to survive, that clearly meant they were plotting something. The logic was peak medieval. They escaped danger? Suspicious. Better increase the danger. And yet, behind the hysteria, these underground systems saved countless lives. They preserved knowledge, protected families, and kept cultural traditions alive during centuries of hostility. Some historians even argue that they laid the early groundwork for later, more organized resistance movements during the Renaissance. Ironically, the only medieval conspiracy theorists who got this one right were the ones who meant harm. They sensed there was an invisible network, and they just completely misinterpreted its purpose. It wasn't a threat. It was a lifeline. So yeah, the conspiracy was real. But instead of plotting the downfall of Europe, these networks were doing something wildly uncharacteristic for the Middle Ages. They were helping people. Medieval Europe officially ran on feudalism. Kings, nobles, peasants, duties, tithes, and taxes that made absolutely no sense to anyone, including the people collecting them. This was the system everyone talked about, the system written in charters, the system priests preached about while conveniently ignoring their own financial dealings. This city stretched for kilometers when on the move, encompassing not only soldiers and cavalry, but also engineers, siege specialists, medics, blacksmiths, cooks, scribes, and interpreters. Behind them came thousands of animals, mules, camels, pack horses, each loaded with essential tools, food supplies, spare weapons, and medical equipment. This army had no trucks, no engines, no radios, or other modern technology. Yet it coordinated movement across some of the harshest terrain on Earth with a level of precision that modern militaries still study and admire. Alexander inherited a brilliant system from his father, King Philip II, but he refined it ruthlessly, optimizing it for speed and efficiency. Later, in Mesopotamia and India, river fleets became floating supply depots. Boats escorted the army, carrying tons of grain, medical supplies, extra weapons, and even replacement horses. These fleets transformed rivers from obstacles into highways. Storms, however, remained relentless enemies. On occasion, Alexander halted movement for days, waiting for currents to calm or for engineers to reinforce rafts. He knew that rushing a river crossing could devastate an army faster than any enemy general. Every successful crossing reinforced his legend, but the real triumph lay in logistics. Alexander conquered rivers not through bravery alone, but through preparation, engineering skill, and a disciplined choreography that transformed dangerous waters into stepping stones across an entire continent. Alexander's army marched on more than just grain and discipline. It marched on bodies. The human engine powering his conquests was constantly threatened by exhaustion, wounds, disease, and fear. Keeping tens of thousands of men healthy, motivated, and mentally stable throughout years of relentless campaigning required a logistical strategy as sophisticated as feeding them. Alexander's brilliance lay not only in tactics but also in understanding that an army's spirit could break long before its supply lines. Medical logistics began with trained personnel. The army included physicians, herbalists, and surgeons who traveled with the baggage train. Their tools, bronze scalpels, cauterizing irons, bandages, herbal mixtures, and splints, were carefully packed and restocked whenever possible. On the march, medics treated blisters, infections, and fevers. During battles, they established mobile stations where wounded men were carried by comrades or slaves. Alexander set a certain cultural precedent. Medical care was honorable, not shameful, and a wounded soldier was never abandoned. This alone saved countless lives. If daylight showcased the Subura's noise and poverty, nighttime revealed its teeth. Crime wasn't a lurking force here. It walked openly, breathed the same smoke-filled air, and moved through every alley with practiced ease. The Subura was notorious across Rome for its thieves, gangs, and shadow networks, so deeply rooted that even the city guard entered reluctantly, and only in groups. The thieves came first. Pickpockets slipped through crowds like fish darting through reeds. Children often learned the craft before they learned letters. They tugged at belts, slipped hands into coin purses, or sliced open bags with tiny knives. The smarter ones didn't steal boldly. They created distractions, a staged argument, a sudden fall, a spilled basket of fruit. While all eyes turned, a purse vanished. Losing money in the Subura wasn't a rare misfortune. It was expected. Then there were the burglars. At night, they moved across rooftops, creeping through open windows or cutting through weak shutters. Instantly were perfect targets. Dozens of residents crammed into flimsy apartments with almost no ability to secure their belongings. Burglars didn't always work alone. Many belonged to one of the Subura's gangs, loose collectives bound not by loyalty, but by profit. Gangs varied in size and reputation. Some controlled gambling dens or brothel protection rackets. Others specialized in extortion, demanding payment from tavern owners to prevent accidents. A few acted almost like unofficial neighborhood guards, helping residents in exchange for coin or shelter. But many gangs were unpredictable, prone to infighting, betrayal, and sudden violence. Their turf wars, fought with fists, clubs, or short daggers, often erupted without warning, sending bystanders scattering. The city's official security force, the cohorts urbani, avoided patrolling the Subura after dark. They knew the terrain favored the locals. Narrow passages, dead-end alleys, rooftop shortcuts. Medieval Europe didn't wait for the Renaissance to start panicking. They were already terrified and already correct about some things. Before the official witch craze, villagers spoke in whispers about wise women gathering herbs at night. These weren't broom-flying sorceresses. They were the local healers, midwives, and unofficial therapists. The people you visited when you couldn't afford a doctor, which was always because doctors in the Middle Ages mostly recommended bleeding you to death. These women knew plants, cures, poisons, childbirth, and how to make your husband's headache disappear, sometimes permanently. Their knowledge was extremely valuable, which immediately made the church suspicious. In medieval Europe, knowing things was practically a crime. So, villages created their own little conspiracy theory. These women were part of a secret network, sharing forbidden knowledge under the moonlight. Herbs were coded messages. Knotted cords were symbols of protection. Midnight gatherings were strategy meetings. And although it all sounds dramatic, it wasn't completely wrong. There were networks of healers who trained each other, passed down knowledge, and shared dangerous remedies quietly so the church wouldn't accuse them of witchcraft. But mistakes were made. Some women cured illnesses that the church failed to cure. Some predicted storms better than priests. Some fixed marriages with love potions that definitely violated several commandments. Naturally, this meant they had to be in league with Satan. When livestock died, blame the healer. When crops failed, blame the healer. When your husband ran off to join the Crusades because you kept nagging him about taking out the chamber pot, surely the healer cast a spell. And yet, beneath all the hysteria, the conspiracy theory held a sliver of truth. There really were secret gatherings of magical practitioners. Only their magic was just science, herbs, and experience. But beneath that wonderfully dysfunctional surface was another system. A quiet, unofficial, unregulated maze of deals, favors, illegal markets, and under-the-table arrangements known today as the shadow economy. In medieval terms, just how things work, my son. And here's the fun part. Everyone pretended it didn't exist while simultaneously participating in it daily. The conspiracy went like this. Groups of thieves, smugglers, money-lenders, and entrepreneurially flexible peasants operated outside the law, forming networks that stretched across towns and even kingdoms. Secret trade routes, black market goods, illegal borrowing, quiet bribes, all happening in every alley and tavern from London to Venice. Medieval people believed in this underground economy. They told stories about it, they warned their children about it, and they drew very dramatic lines in the sand about how sinful it was. And they were absolutely right. Start with the thieves' guilds. Yes, they existed. No, they didn't wear uniforms, but they organized territories, settled disputes, and punished independent thieves for violating professional courtesy. Medieval law enforcement was so useless that thieves created their own HR department. Then there were the unofficial moneylenders, often operating in the back rooms of taverns, monasteries, or that one house on the corner everyone avoided because charging interest was technically a sin, unless you did it quietly, in which case it was mutual aid. Smuggling was everywhere. Salt, wine, grain, wool, ink, iron. If it could be taxed, someone was smuggling it. The king's tariff was less a law and more a polite suggestion no one took seriously. Entire villages would mysteriously lose shipments right before tax collectors arrived, only for those same goods to reappear moments later in the barn of someone named Petro, who found them on the road. Criminals navigated them as if they were second nature. Officers risked ambushes, mockery, or worse. When they did enter, it was usually to retrieve a corpse, break up a riot, or escort a politician's private guard. Information was currency. Criminals traded it like merchants traded spices. Who was carrying money? Who owed debts? Who was new to the district and likely unprepared? The Subura was a district where secrets didn't remain hidden for long, and where those who kept their mouths shut survived the longest. Yet, for all its danger, residents adapted. They walked quickly, kept purses hidden, avoided certain alleys, and learned which faces meant trouble. The Subura didn't ask for moral judgment. It demanded awareness. In a place where criminals lived door to door with honest laborers, survival meant understanding one simple truth. The shadows ruled the streets, and the streets never slept. Beneath the noise, crime, and nightlife, the Subura had another identity. It was the engine room of Rome. This district wasn't populated only by thieves and drunkards. It was home to tens of thousands of honest laborers and craftsmen whose sweat kept the empire functioning. If Rome ate, built, manufactured, hauled, cleaned, or repaired anything, odds were good it passed through the hands of a Suburan worker. At dawn, long before the taverns emptied, the laborers emerged. Men carrying baskets, ropes, bricks, clay pots, and tools filtered out of the insulae like a river of exhaustion. Porters headed toward markets and warehouses to haul sacks of grain, amphorae of wine, or crates of fish. Builders marched to construction sites carrying chisels and mallets, ready to carve stone or mix mortar under the burning sun. Carpenters, metalworkers, leather tanners, and cobblers opened their workshops, small rooms lit by a single lamp where the air smelled of sweat, burning charcoal, and raw materials. Women worked just as hard. In a world run by superstition, competence looked supernatural. So, medieval villagers began hunting witches long before the official manuals even existed. They charged them in local courts, questioned them in barns, and occasionally tried to drown them in rivers. These early witch hunts were sloppy, chaotic, and extremely unprofessional, but tragically real. The irony is painful. The only witches who actually existed were the ones trying to keep everyone alive, which in the Middle Ages was suspicious behavior indeed. Medieval kings were incredibly dramatic. They loved grand gestures, heroic speeches, unnecessary wars, and occasionally faking their own deaths, or at the very least making everyone think they did. And the wild part is medieval people suspected this. They whispered about it in taverns. They passed rumors down through generations. And in at least one deliciously messy case, their conspiracy theory wasn't entirely wrong. Enter Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, a man so eccentric, so intelligent, and so uncomfortably ahead of his time that Europe genuinely didn't know what to do with him. He spoke multiple languages, loved science, wrote poetry, and kept a personal zoo, which automatically made him suspicious in the eyes of medieval peasants who believed that any man who liked books was probably consorting with demons. Frederick II's death in 1250 was grand, public, and witnessed. The church breathed a sigh of relief. Europe buried him. Everyone moved on. Except they didn't, because almost immediately, rumors spread that Frederick wasn't really dead. He was merely hiding, resting, waiting, preparing to return and reclaim the empire like some medieval Batman, but with worse armor and better falconry hobbies. Entire cults sprang up around the idea. People claimed they saw him wandering forests in disguise. Merchants reported meeting a mysterious nobleman who paid in Frederick's old coinage. A fisherman insisted that the emperor asked him for directions. Markets had their own conspiracies. Sellers fixed prices, bakers hid cheap flour and bread, butchers adjusted weights, and fishmongers claimed their fish was fresh when it clearly died during the First Crusade. Everyone lied a little, stole a little, and nodded politely at Sunday Mass as if God hadn't watched them cheat 3 customers that morning. So yeah, the medieval shadow economy was real, it was thriving, and it was the only part of the economy that actually worked consistently. The biggest conspiracy wasn't that it existed. It was that everyone pretended they weren't involved. Night arrived softly in Kiang, like silk settling over the city. But the pleasure quarters never truly slept. As the sun dipped behind the palace roofs and merchants shuttered their shops, another world awakened. One built not on laws or duty, but on sensation, artistry, and the delicate promise of escape. Lanterns sparked to life first, their flames trembling gently as servants carried them out in long chains. Each flame was protected by lacquered shades of red, gold, and soft jade. Soon, the entire district glowed like a small constellation brought down to earth, shimmering above the cobblestones worn smooth by generations of wandering feet. Walking through the first archway, a visitor heard the world transform. The clatter of daytime markets faded behind, replaced by the soft strum of zither, the rhythmic tapping of wooden blocks, and laughter drifting through silk curtains. Tea houses opened their doors with quiet pride, each promising a slightly different atmosphere. Some peaceful and scholarly, others lively and filled with actors rehearsing lines before their evening performances. The air carried scents of roasted barley tea, honeyed pastries, sandalwood incense, and a hint of plum wine. What made Kaifeng's floating world unique wasn't just its beauty, but its illusion, the sense that once inside, time loosened its grip. Many spent their days washing clothes in public basins, grinding grain, weaving wool, or selling vegetables on street corners. Some cooked simple meals to sell: bowls of porridge, bread with cheese, figs, boiled chickpeas, or salted fish. Children helped, carrying water, tending fires, or shouting prices to attract customers. In the Sabura, work began early and ended late because survival didn't allow for leisure. Craftsmen were the backbone of the district. The clang of blacksmiths shaping iron tools echoed down the alleys. Potters turned clay at their doorsteps, shaping cups and storage jars that would be sold across the city. Shoemakers stitched sandals for soldiers, slaves, and merchants alike. Every trade existed here, from barbers shaving faces in the street to scribes writing legal contracts for those who could afford literacy. Despite the chaos around them, laborers supported each other. Neighbors shared food when someone fell ill. Women watched one another's children. Water carriers offered a drink to exhausted workers for a single coin. It wasn't generosity, it was necessity. Life in the Sabura was too hard to face alone. Money stretched thin. Most residents lived from one wage to the next, constantly battling hunger, rent, illness, and overcrowding. But what the Sabura lacked in comfort, it made up for in resilience. Every face told a story of survival. Every workshop spoke of skill. Every dawn revealed a district that, despite its vice and violence, kept Rome fed, clothed, and moving. The Sabura wasn't pretty, but it worked, and Rome worked because of it. Peasants swore that a hooded figure attending Mass in Sicily had Frederick's exact posture, which is a very specific thing to notice unless you're completely obsessed. You'd think this was just typical medieval delusion, but then things got complicated. Into this chaos walked Richard of Eastwell, a man who claimed to be Richard III's secret son centuries later, another suspiciously educated, suspiciously refined stranger who refused to explain his background. He spoke Latin. He knew royal etiquette. He had the bearing of someone who never carried his own laundry. Historians still argue about him. In both cases, something is undeniably off. Medieval rulers occasionally staged dramatic farewells, vanished for months, or switched identities for political safety. And since record-keeping was essentially just Bob wrote it down before spilling wine all over it, who could truly confirm anything? So yes, the conspiracy theory stood on shaky but tantalizing legs. Sometimes kings didn't actually die. They just retired in secret, letting everyone else deal with the mess. And in a way, who could blame them? If you lived in a world of plagues, rebellions, crusades, and poison soup, you'd fake your death, too. Scholars who had spent their days buried in scrolls arrived to recite fresh poetry. Government clerks, exhausted by bureaucracy, sought a few hours of elegance. Even wandering monks were known to pause at the district's entrance, watching quietly as if observing another realm entirely. The streets twisted like painted ribbons, each turn revealing a new spectacle. A puppeteer surrounded by children, a masked performer practicing acrobatic leaps, courtesans behind gauzy screens preparing their hairpins, calligraphy sets, and embroidered robes. Everything was movement, music, and anticipation, yet contained within a serene, dreamlike order. Visitors often remarked that entering Kang's pleasure quarters felt like stepping into a painting where nothing harsh or hurried could intrude. The laughter was gentle, the music soft and rounded, the lantern light warm enough to make even passing faces appear poetic. It was a world both real and unreal, crafted deliberately to soothe the mind, stir curiosity, and make every guest feel, if only for an evening, weightless. Here, pleasure wasn't loud or crude. It was refined, carefully arranged, and wrapped in artistry. And this was only the beginning. If the entrance to Kaifeng's floating world was a soft breath, then its tea houses were a heartbeat, steady, warm, and endlessly inviting. They lined the district like polished jewels, each with its own character, yet all sharing a devotion to refinement. Some were modest, with bamboo blinds and simple clay pots. Others glowed with lacquered pillars, jade green tiles, and carved screens depicting cranes, plum blossoms, or scenes from beloved operas. Together, they formed a delicate corridor of light and aroma, enticing newcomers deeper into the quarter. Stepping inside a tea house meant entering an atmosphere carefully woven from ritual and intimacy. The first sensation was always the scent: toasted barley, chrysanthemum petals, osmanthus blossoms, or the deeper, earthier warmth of pressed bricks softened by age. Servers moved with practiced grace, gliding between silk cushions and low wooden tables with trays of steaming cups arranged like miniature constellations. Conversations remained hushed, as though even laughter respected the delicate balance of flavors and sounds. These tea houses were more than just places to drink. They were listening rooms, social theaters, and sanctuaries for wandering thoughts. Scholars gathered to debate poetry and philosophy, challenging one another with verses scribbled hastily on scrolls. Aspiring officials discussed their exam prospects, pretending calm while hiding their anxiety. Merchants negotiated deals beneath layers of polite formality, and soldiers passing through the capital sat quietly, savoring a few hours of peace before returning to harsher duties. Yet the true charm of these spaces came from the courtesans who performed within them. Unlike the women of the brothels, these artists were prized for their mastery of subtlety. They recited poems with gentle clarity, played zither whose strings shimmered under lamplight, and painted calligraphy so fluid it seemed to breathe. Their presence didn't overwhelm the room. Instead, they shaped it, each movement balanced and deliberate. Visitors often felt as though the tea houses held a secret rhythm. Voices flowed like soft rivers, music rose in delicate waves, and the clinking of porcelain cups punctuated each moment like a quiet heartbeat. Some guests came seeking conversation, others came seeking silence, but all left with the same lingering impression. Here, time slowed down and became gentle, as if it too wished to sit and savor one more cup. In the floating world of Qifeng, pleasure began not with desire, but with calm, and the tea houses were its purest expression. As night deepened in Kaifeng's floating world, the tea houses exhaled their last trails of steam, and another sound began to rise. The distant thrum of drums, the flutter of silk sleeves, and the warm chorus of voices filtering from the district's many theaters. These were the soul of the pleasure quarters, places where imagination wasn't merely entertained but completely unbound. To enter a Kang theater was to surrender oneself to dreams painted in movement, color, and song. The buildings themselves were wonders of careful craftsmanship. Some were simple wooden halls with open stages and benches worn smooth by years of use. Others rivaled temple architecture with carved rafters, dragon-headed beams, and facades decorated with scenes from ancient myths. Lanterns hung overhead in tiered arrangements, casting a golden glow that softened every contour and turned the audience's faces into floating shapes of anticipation. Inside, actors prepared behind screens painted with plum blossoms and running horses. Their makeup was not merely decoration, but transformation. white powder to smooth the face into an otherworldly mask, bold crimson accents to define emotion, and ink-black lines that could shift an expression with the slightest movement of the eyes. Costumes shimmered in the lamplight. Embroidered robes of turquoise, mustard yellow, snow lotus white, and imperial red, each carrying symbols of the roles they were meant to embody. The performances themselves were a harmony of disciplines, blending poetry, martial arts, dance, and music. A single gesture of a silk sleeve could suggest heartbreak. The twirl of a sword could spark tension like a sudden gust of wind. Musicians sat at one side of the stage, plucking zither, striking wooden clappers, or coaxing long, trembling notes from bamboo flutes. Stories from the past came alive. Generals torn between duty and love, spirits haunting the mortal world, lovers separated by family honor, immortals descending from clouds painted on backdrop screens. For the audience, the theater offered escape of the purest kind. Merchants forgot their ledgers, scholars forgot their exams, wandering travelers forgot their fatigue. In the pleasure quarters, a well-told story could lift a person out of the weight of everyday life and gently place them in another realm entirely. When the final note faded and lanterns dimmed, guests emerged slowly, as if waking from a shared dream. And as they stepped back into the glowing streets, Kang's floating world seemed even more magical, as though the performances had seeped into the night itself. In the heart of Kang's floating world, beyond the tea houses and theaters, lived the figures who embodied the district's deepest allure, the courtesans. These weren't merely entertainers, nor simply companions. They were artists in the fullest sense, trained from childhood in poetry, music, painting, etiquette, and the delicate, unspoken art of emotional presence. To meet a renowned courtesan was to encounter refinement shaped into human form. Their residences, known as Huai Yuan, flower pavilions, stood quietly behind carved wooden gates. Some were small and intimate, filled with soft cushions, shelves of inkstones, and vases of seasonal blossoms changed daily by servants. Others were grand, with inner courtyards, koi ponds, and moon gates through which lantern light drifted like floating petals. Regardless of size, each pavilion carried the gentle fragrance of incense, cosmetics, and newly brushed silk, creating an atmosphere of tranquil anticipation. The courtesan's charm began long before she spoke. Her appearance was a composition in itself. Hair styled into elegant loops and combed smooth with perfumed oils, silk robes dyed in hues that flattered her complexion. Pale lilac, lake blue, lotus white, embroidered with subtle threads of silver or gold. When she moved, the fabrics whispered, soft as breath. When she sat, her posture carried the serenity of someone who understood the power of stillness. But their true art was expression. A courtesan could recite a Tang poem with such clarity that each syllable felt like falling dew. She could paint calligraphy characters so fluid that the strokes seemed to ripple like water. She could play the pipa with fingers so deft that listeners swore they heard not wood and strings, but wind moving through bamboo. Even her conversation carried a gentle rhythm, attentive, thoughtful, never hurried. Visitors sought them not for crude pleasure, but for respite from the world. Scholars discussed verses with them and left inspired. Officials worn thin by politics found comfort in their patience and wit. Young nobles, restless and uncertain, felt steadied by their quiet confidence. A single evening with a talented courtesan could feel like stepping into a sanctuary where one's burdens melted, replaced by calm. Yet beneath their elegance lay an unspoken truth. The life of a courtesan required discipline, artistry, and resilience. Their refinement wasn't effortless. It was crafted with devotion. And for those who entered their pavilions, the experience remained unforgettable. A moment suspended between reality and beauty, held gently in graceful hands. Beyond the flower pavilions, deeper into the dimmer alleys of Kang's floating world, stood the establishments that blended art with intimacy, the refined brothels.